Now on its fourth day, Ukraine's surprise offensive into the Kursk region of Russia is considered to be a daring gambit likely intended to divert Russian forces and snatch back the war's momentum. But it also comes with major risks for Ukrainian military that is short on reserves and struggling to hold back Russian advances into Donetsk Oblast. Much about the Ukrainian offensive is still unclear. Kiev has remained rather tight-lipped, and Ukrainian units have released scant battlefield footage. What little information is available comes from chiefly Russian-released videos, as well as a whirlwind of unconfirmed and often contradictory reports from Telegram. In today's video, I will rely on two primary credible sources that will give a good overview of what has occurred in this offensive thus far, as well as the Ukrainian armed forces' likely aims, and of course, the obvious risks. So let's get into it. Following an artillery bombardment, Ukrainian forces attacked across the border between Sumy and Kursk regions on the morning of the 6th of August. Ukrainian troops, which comprised battalions from several brigades reinforced by air defense systems, broke through the territory of the Kursk region to the east and west of the Sudzha border. According to Medusa, the border crossing was taken the next day, and dozens of Russian border guards surrendered. The Ukrainians initially advanced in two directions according to the Long War Journal, east to the border of Sudzha and north to the town of Koronevo. Though the attacking forces' precise size and composition remains unclear, we know firstly that this offensive is certainly larger in scale and ambition than Ukraine's previous cross-border invasions, as those raids were conducted by units subordinate to Ukrainian military intelligence, while this offensive includes regular UAF forces. Secondly, the composition of the Russian border guards were mere light infantry units created in Russia's southern regions in 2023 to protect against these very same type raids. They are composed largely of conscripts and were not designed to provide stubborn resistance nor to confront regular Ukrainian troops with heavy equipment. Russia's defense ministry said the initial attack comprised up to 300 troops from Ukraine's 22nd Separate Mechanized Brigade equipped with 11 tanks and 20 other armored fighting vehicles. But General Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff, later claimed it involved up to 1,000 troops. Whatever the size of the initial attack, additional forces have likely followed. Videos of Ukrainian columns posted on Telegram on August 6th to 7th showed US-donated Striker infantry carrier vehicles. The 80th Brigade is one of a handful of Ukrainian units known to operate Strikers. On the first day of the offensive, the armed forces of Ukraine, according to Medusa, were able to occupy 4 villages west of Severodolivka: Greenway, Leonidovo, Lyubimovka, and Nova Ivanovka. Further progress was either not part of the plan or was stopped by Russian airstrikes and the first Russian reserves that arrived. The second group bypassed Sudzha from the west and quickly reached the village of Malaya Loknia. There, mainly mobile light infantry groups turned east, covering Sudzha from the north. They reached the Sudzha-Kursk highway, where they tried to stop the supply of Russian troops. By the end of the third day, the armed forces of Ukraine controlled the western outskirts of Sudzha, but not the city center. The route to Kursk was not completely physically blocked by them, but was controlled by fire as well as kamikaze drones. It is estimated that in total, Ukraine was able to advance up to 10 kilometers in the first day. Now, although there were warnings about a Ukrainian buildup in Sumy Oblast in the days prior to the offensive, the attack evidently caught Russia off guard. Ukrainian operational security seems to have been tight. Russia also left the border weakly defended, protected mainly by conscript and border guards. Now, under the Russian system, conscripts are people completing their 1-year military service and are distinct from mobilized troops and are actually prohibited from fighting inside Ukraine. So here we have proof that all those previous Western media articles alleging that Russians are using poorly trained conscripts to fight inside Ukraine are patently false. Ukraine was able to exploit their surprise with a highly mobile force that advanced rapidly into Russian territory, overrunning or bypassing defensive positions near the border. Now I suggest after you finish this video, or you can pause here and click the link in the top corner of the screen, that you watch my video entitled The Final Phase of This War, which is based on an excellent report from a retired US Colonel Alex Vishinin, where he comments on the two phases that comprise all attrition wars. He makes the case that while Americans and the NATO and the West in general are skilled in maneuver warfare, the Russians are the gods of attrition. Applying it to this scenario, what I see here is admittedly a skillful use of maneuver warfare by Ukraine. This to me has all the markings of US and NATO intelligence and training. This is what the West is good at, and therefore I do not believe that Ukraine acted by itself as some of the recent articles from the West, particularly that of war correspondent David Axe of Forbes magazine, claims. John Hardy of the Long War Journal says that Ukrainian forces were able to surround and capture some 50 Russian troops at the Sudza border checkpoint. Indeed, Ukraine was able to quickly reach Sudza's environs and appeared to have taken at least part of the town. But a large chunk of the Ukrainian force seems to have turned left at Sudza, pressing northward along the road connecting that town to Lvov. As of the 8th of August, Ukrainian troops had reached Malaya Loknia, a village roughly 13 kilometers from the border, though they apparently met at least some resistance from the Russians there. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces pressed north from the area around the village of Darino and Serdikovo, after reportedly meeting some initial resistance. Footage released on social media indicates that by August 7th, Ukrainians had progressed at least 12 kilometers from the border to the area around Novo-Ivanovka. Russia has begun dispatching forces to try to contain and roll back the Ukrainian advances, though it remains unclear exactly which units Moscow has sent. What is known is that a Chechen Spetsnaz detachment that has been fighting in northern Kharkiv Oblast claims to have redeployed to Kursk on the 6th of August.
Ситуация, я об этом уже говорил, да, достаточно-таки серьезная. Значит, противника зашло на нашу территорию тоже достаточно-таки много. Но, если сказать правильно, она, в принципе, уже взята под контроль. Мы максимально уже контролируем ситуацию. Получается, наши подразделения, значит, при поддержке спецназа «Ахмат» сегодня с утра зачистили населенный пункт Мартыновка, взяв его под полный контроль. Что будет, конечно, пока неизвестно, но факт заключается в том, что на данный момент этот населенный пункт мы взяли под полный контроль. Значит, большую часть этого направления, участка, в принципе, потихоньку зачищаем, выбиваем противника, уничтожая его. Потихоньку, как говорится, берем под контроль. На данный момент могу констатировать факт, что действительно очень большое количество бронированной техники противника и личного состава за эти несколько дней действительно уничтожено.
Medusa thinks that this may be part of Ukraine's plan. In this report, it is said that the UAF had unsuccessfully tried to oust the Russian troops in Kharkiv and Vovchansk, so that it could free up some 8 to 10 brigades of the UAF, which had been sent there since May. Despite this failure, it seems that Ukraine's intelligence has made sure that Russia's border in other areas remained without reliable cover, facilitating this Kursk surprise offensive. The goal, however, according to Medusa, is to hopefully force the northern Russian forces to ease pressure on Kharkiv, which in turn would allow the UAF to push them back into Russia. So at this juncture, I think it's appropriate for me to weigh in on what my theory on the purpose of this Kursk border raid really is for the Ukraine armed forces. My theory is that the Kursk offensive has really one primary military goal, and that is to afford the Ukrainian armed forces and President Zelensky some bargaining chips in the upcoming eventual peace negotiations. As it currently stands, not only has Ukraine not had any noteworthy battlefield victories since 2022, but President Putin has made it clear that the 4 annexed regions of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk are off the table in any negotiations. But with the recent Russian invasion into Kharkiv on the northern flank, which has given the Russian army a very strong foothold in Kharkiv, and which for almost 2 months now the Ukrainian army has been unable to push them out, there is a chance that President Putin can use that foothold to make a claim for Kharkiv Oblast as well in any upcoming peace talks. After all, Kharkiv and Odessa have always been considered by Putin as Russian. Now, I am well aware of the fact that the Russian forces only have a foothold in a very small segment of the Kharkiv Oblast, but the point is, because Ukraine is unable to push them out, that bridgehead operates to me similar to what breakaway regions in Ukraine and in Georgia operate for the Russians. The importance of Kharkiv being the second largest city in Ukraine and its noteworthy contribution economically to Ukraine cannot be understated and underscores its importance to Ukraine's economic survival, especially in the absence of the industrial regions that are now under Russian control in the east. Thus, I think, with Ukraine's current foothold in Kursk, if they can hold on to that at least until the peace talks ensue, they can use this to bargain against Putin, a bargain which will likely involve Ukraine being willing to give back Kursk or remove its troops from Kursk in exchange for Russia removing all its troops from the foothold in Kharkiv. So back to today's report. Russian tanks were seen moving on August 7th and 8th, and their symbols indicate they came from Russia's Sever grouping, which is responsible for the northern Kharkiv Oblast as well as Russia's Bryansk and Belgorod regions. John Hardy comments that Russia has reserves in these regions and currently Russian heavy equipment is likely arriving in Kursk Oblast in greater numbers as of the 9th of August. So let's talk about the Ukrainian objectives in this incursion. It is likely that the Ukrainian armed forces have multiple aims as Russia did in its Kharkiv incursion. The Long War Journal says firstly, they want to divert Russian troops from other points, just as the Russians were able to do in their Kharkiv front. In particular, the goal would be to relieve pressure in Donetsk Oblast where Ukrainian troops are struggling to hold back Russian advances, or to enable Ukraine to recapture Russian-controlled territory in northern Kharkiv Oblast as I mentioned earlier. Second, Kiev is likely seeking to reinvigorate Ukrainian morale and Western confidence in Ukraine, reversing a downbeat narrative that has taken hold over the last 10 months. On that score, Ukraine has already achieved some success. Mr. Hardy thinks that the operation has electrified the Ukrainian and Western media while sparking alarm and fury in Russia. A possible third aim could be to gain leverage in potential peace negotiations. Russian sources report that Ukrainian troops have begun digging in and suggesting Kiev seeks to hold the captured territory at least temporarily. Now here's where things can go terribly wrong for the Ukrainian armed forces in this Kursk incursion. Despite its initial success, the Kursk offensive comes with serious risks. Most immediately is the fact that Ukraine's rapid advance has elongated its supply lines and may have created narrow salients whose flanks are vulnerable to Russian counterattacks. If Russia can bring significant forces to bear before Ukraine can widen those salients and organize a robust defense, Ukrainian troops could be easily cut off. It is unclear exactly what proportion of the Ukrainian forces available for this operation have already been committed. In the bigger picture, Ukraine took a gamble by committing its limited reserves to the Kursk offense rather than reinforcing its defense in Donetsk Oblast, where those forces arguably would have better been used. Russia is currently grinding its way toward the city of Kursk, a key logistics hub. Russian troops have also reached the outskirts of Toretsk and are attempting to push deeper into Chasiv Yar. More than that, Russia's rate of advance has quickened in recent weeks, mainly due to Kiev's shortage of manpower. This has been the Ukrainian military's chief problem since last year. Defending units simply lack enough infantry to hold positions. In quotations, it is madness. We are fighting with cooks, electricians, and mechanics, one Ukrainian brigade commander fighting in Donetsk Oblast recently lamented. In the spring, Kiev took steps to begin redressing the shortage, including by passing a long-delayed legislation to expand its pool of mobilization-eligible men. Ukrainian officials say the mobilization rate has since surged, but the problem will take time to fix. Fresh troops must be trained, and Ukraine's training pipeline has limited throughput capacity. Meanwhile, as a quick but important segue, which weighs on the risk the Ukrainian armed forces has taken in this gamble, the Russian armed forces continue their advance against the Toretsk agglomeration in the center of Donbass. The satellite villages of Druzhba, Pivdeny, Pivnichnoye, and Salizhnoye, and New York are almost completely captured. More worryingly, between New York and Zalizny, the Ukrainian troops are under serious threat of encirclement. Ukrainian forces are trying to counterattack, but probably if the balance of forces does not manage to change in the coming weeks, they would have to retreat to the southwest of Toretsk. If Toretsk falls, the Russian army may reach Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar from the south. Further, in the Kursk direction, the pace of the offensive has quickened according to Meduza, and the Russians are close to capturing another fortified area of the UAF near the village of Zelenoye, on the railway. If the pace of this offensive continues, Meduza believes that by early autumn, Russia will reach Pokrovsk itself and neighboring Munograd. At that point, even before fighting begins, these two cities will cease to be the main logistics hub for the UAF in the central and southern Donbass area. Thus, Meduza thinks that the Ukrainian command does not have much time for offensives in the north of the country, largely because additional forces are needed near Pokrovsk sector right now. So back to the analysis on the Kursk offensive. Kiev seems to have scraped the bottom of the barrel to put together forces for the Kursk offensive. The 80th Air Assault Brigade, one of the units apparently participating in the Kursk offensive, was in the middle of reconstituting after tough fighting in the Donetsk Oblast. In late July, a scandal erupted when the 80th Brigade commander was demoted for refusing orders he deemed unrealistic given his brigade's current staffing and readiness level. One can now guess he was referring to the Kursk offensive, writes the article. The worst case scenario for Ukraine is that Russia manages to drive back and severely attrit Ukrainian units in Kursk Oblast without meaningfully weakening its position on other fronts. Given Russia's advantage in force availability, that is not implausible. Currently, and what I'm about to read here from this article will drive a dagger in the hearts of pro-Ukrainians salivating at the prospect of this Kursk offensive. The report reads, and I quote, "Currently, there is no evidence that Russia has diverted troops from the Pokrovsk axis, which is Russia's main effort, or the Toretsk axis, and Moscow has likely sufficient resources elsewhere to avoid having to do so." The fact is, even if Ukraine manages to hold territory in Kursk Oblast, those forces will be unavailable for use elsewhere. The operation could take a life of its own, sucking in more resources than initially intended. The Kursk offensive may turn out to be a masterstroke that wrests back momentum from Moscow. Or as is far more likely, it can turn out to be a self-inflicted error that compounds Ukraine's manpower shortage, even as its defense in the Donetsk Oblast continues to deteriorate. Only time will tell.